Good afternoon, everyone. It's a terrific pleasure to welcome you all. My name is Kaustubh Bandyopadhyay, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's Samvad or conversation on investing in civil society innovations. This is the seventh conversation organized by Priya as part of its 40th anniversary celebration. The conversation on investing in civil society innovations is being organized in partnership with Center for Social Impact and Philanthropy at the Ashoka University based in India and the Nudge Foundation also based in India. We are extremely proud of this partnership and solidarity. A special word of thanks to Ingrid and Sudha for representing these two great organizations in today's conversation. We also have an outstanding list of speakers and discussions who will share their thoughts with us today, and I will introduce them one by one in a moment. But let me first invite my colleague, Ms. Yashvi Sharma. Yashvi will take us through a short presentation depicting Priya's 40 years of journey with a special focus on the theme empowering civil society. Yashvi.
Priya's 40 years of journey has been an exciting, a journey about sustaining an independent, forward-looking and energetic in an otherwise rapidly disruptive and uncertain world. We have always considered ourselves as educators and facilitators, supporting individuals, organizations, grassroots, and to initiate, learn, and sustain.
Yashvi, can I ask you to check your sound? If I'm not the only one who's experiencing this, can you please check your sound, please?
Hello, is it better then now?
Much better, Yashvi. Sorry.
Okay. Welcome again. Priya's 40 years of journey has been an exciting one. A journey about sustaining an independent, forward-looking and energetic civil society organization in an otherwise rapidly disruptive and uncertain world. We have always considered ourselves as educators and facilitators, supporting individuals, organizations and grassroots initiatives to learn, change, grow and sustain themselves. Priya's support has been in the form of sharing information and ideas, generating new knowledge, building linkages and relationships, providing intermediation, expertise, and at times emotional support. Priya's theory of change follows bridging the supply and demand sides of any issue or we invest in. Efforts to mobilize individuals, especially the poor and the marginalized section, but increasingly also the middle class, make them aware of their rights and responsibilities, thus fueling their sense of agency to demand services, inclusion, participation, and knowledge. On the supply side, we work with government and private agencies and sensitize them to deliver their mandates and be accountable to the citizens. Over the 40 years, Priya has worked on right to learn, right to learn, right to information, and right to participation through various thematic areas of citizen participation, gender integration, empowering civil society, decentralized community government, sustainable urban future, and building knowledge democracy. As Priya celebrates its 40th anniversary, we recommit ourselves for removing obstacles to sustainable change, raising individual and collective voices, and making democracy work for all in everyday life. Empowering civil society has been one of the oldest programs of Priya, and therefore it has the longest history of our intervention. Priya contributions to empowering civil society can be broadly categorized into three pieces. First, building human and institutional capacities in civil society. Second, nurturing independent identity and role of civil society. Third, enabling ecosystem for a vibrant civil society. In early 80s, Priya provided support to hundreds of voluntary organizations to clarify their vision, mission, and strategies to be effective at the grassroots. As the CSO grew and matured, Priya provided training, mentoring, and coaching support on a variety of themes related to institutional strengthening. Some of these are mentioned here. One such flagship program was Development Management Education, DME, which utilized the best resources available to the sector to build perspective and skills of our several hundred civil society organizations. Priya, in partnership with a number of partners, conceptualized and implemented Management in Development Mind Fellowship in the late 90s to catalyze hundreds of new grassroots groups in the so-called Bimaru states of India, some of whom are now the best-known CSOs in the country and continue to be effective on the ground. While Priya continued as a support organization to provide capacity support to grassroots groups, it became imperative to constructively engage with BLI, MLI, and global private foundations who have been principal resource providers to numerous civil society groups in the global south. Priya, as the global chair of International Forum on Capacity Building of Southern NGOs, IFC, vigorously advocated these institutions for greater investment in capacity building from 1998 to 2002 by defining what capacity entails from a Southern NGO perspective across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Caribbean. Since 2008, Priya International Academy has been spearheading the capacity building efforts of Priya through its numerous educational programs customized for civil society and nonprofits. Priya has been instrumental in catalyzing the birth of Civicus and FIM Forum for Democratic Global Governance, two global forums which have been championing civil society voices since their inception. We are proud that Dr. Rajesh Tandon, the founder president of Priya, was also the founding chair of both these institutes. In order to reconceptualize civil society in the Asian context, Priya undertook two seminal research studies in early 2000. First, civil society in the new millennium in partnership with the Commonwealth Foundation. Second, defining the non-profit sector, which highlighted the economic contributions of non-profit in partnership with Johns Hopkins University. A decade later, Priya led the global study on civil society at Crossroads, which involved 18 countries from both North and South to take a stock of new challenges and opportunities for civil society. As many middle-income countries, along with India, experienced aggressive economic growth, the Indian government's global leadership aspiration also grew. Since 2010, India has been providing nearly $3 billion of support to other countries under the broad rubric of South-South cooperation. Unfortunately, much of it has been government. Priya, along with few civil society partners, have been an active advocate for broadening the development cooperation through engagement of civil society and other stakeholders. Priya has been providing leadership to the Forum for Indian Development Cooperation by highlighting the innovations and contribution of Indian civil society in global development. In a nutshell, these have been a phenomenal journey. But new challenges to civil society would require new capacities and an enabling environment, and Priya must respond to. I would like to stop here and request Dr. Boston to take this conversation forward.
Thank you so much, Yashvi. If you could move to the next slide. And as you could see that, Priya has fostered a number of innovations over the last 40 years. So it's not only participatory research in Asia, but also a lot of co-traveler, other civil society groups have been fostering civil society innovations. In a way, civil society has served as groundswell for development innovations over several decades, not only in India, across the world, and particularly in the developing world. And these innovations have been possible in an enabling ecosystem that has helped foster such innovations. And if I may just cite a couple of those elements of this enabling ecosystem, one has been, of course, flexible funding, and flexible funding mostly from the international donors, but increasingly also from the domestic resource providing organization. The second element to this enabling ecosystem has been a deep recognition from the government and other stakeholders, and their willingness to utilize those innovations and to scale them up, which can impact positively millions of people, particularly the poor and the marginalized. And civil society largely has been able to maintain a deep connection with the community that they work with or work for those communities. As newer development challenges emerge, these would require newer solutions, which means that innovations must continue. And we just cannot use our old innovations and continue with that. With the newer challenges, newer innovative works is very much required. But with the changing resource support, tougher regulations on the civil society organizations and the sector as a whole, and also an emphasis on particular type of scaling up, innovations might be a casualty. That's an apprehension. We see some broad trends, but that is the conversation that we want to undertake today. Next slide, Yashvi. And with this background, we want to explore two key questions. One, what are the best funding practices that foster development innovations by civil society? What needs to change in the current funding practices of resource providers to foster development innovations by civil society? These two are simple questions, but to my mind, these are profound questions. So we have, as I promised, that we'll introduce each of our speakers and discussions. We have stitched together a program. Next slide, Yashvi. So we'll have Ms. Ingrid Srinath, who is the director at Center for Social Impact and Philanthropy at Ashoka University, India, and Mr. Martin O'Brien, who is the founder and executive director of Social Change Initiatives based in Ireland. So Ingrid and Martin, we have requested them to set the stage for this conversation, and then we'll have Ms. Sudha Srinivasan, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the Center for Social Innovations at the Nudge Foundation, India. We have Dr. Samar Varma, who is the Program Officer in the Ford Office in India. We have Dr. Ashok Khosla, Founder Chairperson of Development Alternative Groups, again based in India, and Dr. Barry Knight, who is the Executive Director, Center for Research and Innovations in Social Policy, based in UK, and an independent researchers with Wings UK. So these four discussions will go through in several rounds. We'll be discussing many questions, and then towards the end, I will request Dr. Tandon to draw lessons from this conversation. So that's the overall scheme for today's conversation. I would request the participants to take a look at the chat box. When we introduce each speaker, their detailed bios will be posted. In addition to that, we will be also posting several documents and their links. You can download them and make for your use. So without much delay, let me now invite Ingrid. Ingrid, it's your time.
Thank you, Kaustav. I'm going to try and share my screen. There we go. So first of all, thank you so much for having me be a part of your 40th anniversary celebrations. It is, as you were discussing, just an amazing accomplishment, not just for longevity, but for the width and depth of the impact that Priya has been able to achieve. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the BBC TV series, Goodness Gracious Me, but one of their recurring segments is a character and his father, both of Indian origin, where the father constantly insists that every good thing that exists on the planet comes from India. I'm going to play you a short clip.
I love the new Sherlock series.
Of course you love it, because it's Indian.
Don't start. No, not Sherlock.
Oh, come on, beta, it's obvious. He's not just a detective, he's a consultant. Indian. He lives above a shop. Indian. His best friend's a doctor, for God's sake. How much more Indian can you get?
Come on.
He's even played by a Bengali. Bonajit Kamarband.
This is ridiculous.
Not ridiculous. All TV detectives, Indian.
Rubbish. What about Hercule Poirot? He's from Belgium.
Originally, Harpreet Pyara from Belgaum. Indian. Not stupid. But think about it, yaar. A small, chubby man. Oils his moustache. Speaks in a funny accent. Because he's Gujarati.
When I start to look at just the first names that come to my mind, when I think of some of the pioneering innovations that civil society in India has gifted us with, I feel a little like that character, that everything almost that I can see in the environment that I feel proud of, grateful for, starts with a civil society innovation, from self-help group to barefoot solar mamas to uniquely Indian models like Gunj, to models that have become case studies in management schools around the world, to the right to information that Kaustav briefly spoke about, to a market dominant player like Amul, to a Dan Utsav that existed well before Giving Tuesday was even an idea, to Chipko, which set the trends literally around the world for environmentalism, and so on and so on and so on. And yet, despite the multiple global and regional awards that civil society and recognition that civil society actors in India have received, somehow out there in the last 20 years, we have begun to be seen as ineffective, inefficient, even you might say fuddy-duddy. Why is this? One article that I read in IDR suggested that it is because we are too self-effacing. We don't take credit for the contributions we make. They also suggested that we don't document our work well enough. And so it's not out there to be read and reviewed and cited. Perhaps there's also a syndrome of what you might call pilotitis, where too many things never make it out of the pilot program into the scaled operation. Maybe some of this is a result of the way we're defining innovation these days, where it's seen really as shiny new toys, ideally tech-driven. Certainly, there's a lack of platforms to showcase the contributions and innovations in civil society. And perhaps most importantly, claiming credit or authorship is often actually counterproductive if you want to achieve impact. COVID-19 gave a little push, a nudge, if you will, to innovation across the sector. In the studies that CSIP has done, we did two, one last year, one this year, both of which are available on our website. We saw NGOs, CSOs innovating in the scale of their operations, in the width of the offerings, whether that was increasing or changing their geographical focus, adding new constituencies that they were serving, and in fact, adding new services to their service offerings. We also saw a sharp rise in salience for core issues, whether that was public health or conditions of migrant labor, violence against women, mental health, a whole bunch of issues that civil society organizations, through their seizing this opportunity, really were able to put onto the public agenda. Digitization, of course, was something that many of us, if we were reluctant adopters, were forced to adopt. And you saw our own operations, programs, fundraising, and communications all undergo sea changes across the sector. There was the phenomenon also of disintermediation, where relief was going directly now sometimes from donor to end recipient rather than being routed through a formal civil society organization. So cash transfers and the like started to gain traction. And there was the phenomenon of producer to consumer disintermediation, where essentially as distribution channels all seized up because of lockdown, nonprofits were able to directly connect farmers, craftspeople, a whole bunch of producers directly to their consumers, usually using digital technology. Sadly, of course, there was no dearth of regulatory innovation. And so we were slapped with a number of different new compliance requirements. Coming to the core question for today, which is how can philanthropy foster innovation? I think we're not going to make any headway on this question if we don't first restore agency where it rightly belongs. Since 2013 or thereabouts, with the CSR law and everything that has happened since, somehow nonprofits have been sought to be reduced to what the law calls an implementing agency. And the donor or the provider of capital has somehow become the protagonist. This is very strange, particularly since many new donors actually come from the world of impact investing and venture capital, where the situation is the exact opposite. The second thing I think philanthropy needs to do is really go back to its core role as the provider of long-term, patient, risk capital and not be substituting for government or for market in the ways that it increasingly is. The third one, of course, has been touched upon again by numerous people, but really looking at funding that is far more flexible, that offers far more latitude. And this can range from the corpus grant all the way through to the development impact bond. Funders, I think, also have a role to play in joining the dots. They have the privilege, if you will, of looking at getting this 30,000-foot view of the sector, of viewing across geographies, across themes, across partners. And so they should be able to really spot patterns, make connections across those diverse entities. Innovation, we all know, doesn't happen at head offices. Innovation happens on the periphery. It's where some enterprising program officer decides to subvert the rules of the game a little bit, to deviate from the script, if you will, and try something new. It also happens at intersections between organizations, between people across sectors, people across geographies, people with different experiences. And what funders can do is make those connections more easily. Funders also, I think, need to bring more than their checkbooks to the game. They really need to bring their non-financial assets in terms of their knowledge, their social capital, their influence, their advocacy to lift the narrative around civil society. And finally, something that Priya is all too familiar with, funders really need to make systematic investments in developing the ecosystem for civil society in terms of knowledge, networks, norms, narratives, and a bunch of other areas. For civil society itself, I think we need to take a long, hard look in the mirror and see how we can do a better job of showcasing the work we do. How can we do a better job of promotion and recognition of the sector led by the sector, rather than being the fringe award on some Economic Times corporate award where there's one tiny award for someone from civil society. How can we seize and own the narrative of what gets promoted and what gets recognized? Can we start to carve out and to find and to actively seek the risk capital that we need in order to innovate? Can we stop digging our heels in and stop being obdurate about this and really start to try and understand some of the new social impact capital instruments that are coming our way? And finally, of course, can we strengthen our network so that we have a better voice in shaping the narrative? In sum, if we can go from this daily struggle for survival, where we're barely keeping our heads above water, to a situation where thanks to a well-equipped ecosystem, we can boldly go where no one has gone before. I think we will have achieved our goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. Innovations happen at the periphery and the intersections. It was phenomenal, and what one can expect from Ingrid. Thank you so much, Ingrid. Let me move on to invite Martin O'Brien, who is the founder and executive director of the Social Change Initiative based in Ireland. Martin.
Thank you very much. And like Ingrid, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to join in these celebrations to mark the 40 years of such significant achievements and work and dedication by Priya. So it's a real pleasure to be with you today. I suppose what I want to do is just share a little bit from my own experience with the Social Change Initiative, but also in working for a very large global philanthropic organization called Atlantic Philanthropy. And the mission of that foundation was to make a lasting difference in the lives of marginalized and disadvantaged communities. And I suppose that idea of making a lasting difference led the foundation to have a particular focus on innovation and on changing policies and systems and practices. So the scale of ambition was very large. And I suppose in thinking about this topic, I suppose I was struck by the proverb that necessity is the mother of invention. And I suppose you could adapt that, I think, fairly to say that necessity is the mother of innovation. Or it should be. And it seems to me then that if you are interested, as our foundation was, in making a difference in the lives of marginalized and disadvantaged communities, that it's essential that the people who need the change are at the heart of working out how the change should happen and what the change should be. And so our foundation was very focused on the idea that the people who need the change, the people who are experiencing problems, have the best ideas and the best solutions and the best innovations for dealing with them. And so, you know, in order to innovate, what do people need? And I think they need space, they need time, they need stimulation, they need cross-pollination, they need time to reflect on what's happened previously, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and they need a mixed set of skills and ideas. So, you know, one discipline of people, one frame of looking at a problem isn't usually going to come up with a terribly effective way of addressing that problem, because problems, as we know, particularly wicked problems, are often multifaceted. So that kind of analysis, I suppose, led the donor, Mr. Feeney, who was a very successful businessman, and I think he brought some of that sort of approach to business to the way in which he did his philanthropy. But that kind of a sense led him to adopt a very diverse set of strategies for delivering innovation, for delivering change. And those included providing course support over multi-annual course support to organizations that were clearly in the business of making change, that were clearly in the business and were driven by the idea of coming up with innovative solutions. And that, I think, you know, derived from this idea that people need space and time. And it's another way of talking about the flexible funding that others have already commented on. It also led the foundation to put quite a significant amount of its resources into support for leaders, support for leadership development, support for fellowships to allow people to take time and space and to think about things and to work through. But also a key ingredient of that, and Mr. Feeney was a great believer in bringing very odd groups of people together to reflect and to think about particular problems. So convening people from different backgrounds and different disciplines was a key element in the overall strategy, so that you got all kinds of different ways of thinking about problems and that you actually got the best kind of thinking in a room to do that. So core support for organizations, support for leadership development, fellowships, support for convenings. He also had a very interesting theory. He said that if you put good buildings and good people together, that those provide the sites and venues in which people can do their best work. So a big part of his philanthropy was actually providing state-of-the-art buildings and resources in which creative people could come together to work and to develop solutions. One of the things which Ingrid spoke about was this idea of pilotitis, and the idea that philanthropy and civil society is always piloting things, but that those pilots don't always move on to the mainstreaming, to the scale, to the implementation. And so Mr. Feeney and the Atlantic Philanthropies was very interested in how you could move from a pilot to influence mainstream policy and practice. And so that often led to partnerships with government. And I think philanthropy is often too unwilling to consider and to engage in those kinds of things. Obviously, there are risks attached, but what we did in a number of areas, I think, in terms of trying to influence the way in which dementia care was provided, or the way in which we looked at improving outcomes through early intervention for children and young people. So government had an interest in those things. And so we began, those were the government agenda. And we began then providing flexible resources, external input, evidence-based approaches. All too often, policy making and practice isn't actually based on evidence. And so evaluation, evidence, external input, challenge, having people who weren't, again, from the normal way of thinking about things. And those actually resulted in quite significant examples where pilots have now been mainstreamed. And so I think I would really encourage people to look at that as a way to think. And I mean, talking often to civil servants, they say, yeah, philanthropy comes along, it does these pilots, and then at the end it comes along to us and it says you need to fund this. And at that point, that's just not going to happen. So I think we need to think much earlier about how we're going to mainstream innovations, and we need to think about that at the start, not after that we've proved that innovation is a worthwhile thing. So getting buy-in to these ideas from a broad cross-sector is important. Change obviously doesn't happen easily, and one of the things which, in addition to those kind of partnerships with government, Atlantic was very committed to the whole idea of funding advocacy and funding strategic litigation, so that you could actually incorporate all of these things together into an overall strategy. Change is hard to get. You have to look at the different ways in which you can achieve it. But if you want to influence systems and if you want to influence policy, then you need to be prepared to think about advocacy. You need to be prepared to think about strategic litigation alongside the pilots, alongside the leadership development and the capacity building. I think in conclusion, it seems to me that donors and philanthropy that's keen to support innovation and change needs to think about who it is providing its resources to. And that goes right back to the idea that people who need change should be in the driving seat in relation to all of this. And all too often, philanthropy's resources don't actually find their way to the people who know the problem and need the change. I think there needs to be a large tolerance for failure. People need to be willing to take risks. On the other hand, we need to pay more attention to where we're having success, where is change happening, and we need to then think about investing more in some of those areas. This is a long-term project. There are no short-term, it seems to me, answers to some of these big problems. And so you need to have patience. We need not to move quickly from one latest fetish to the next, and rather to stick with particular problems, to place confidence and trust in organizations, and to, people used to say that Atlantic was a hard foundation to get money from, but once you got the money, you were trusted. And it seems to me that that is quite important. And finally, I suppose the thing I would say is that philanthropy needs to support and resource the space for people to learn, and for people to learn from each other and from what others have done tackling similar problems. And those are, if you're at the coalface dealing with a problem, and a very challenging problem, the things you lack most are the space and time to think and to reflect. And philanthropy is, as Ingrid pointed out, is often in a very privileged position, but it needs to share that privilege more widely and to facilitate that kind of reflection and learning by other people. So those seem to me to be just a few opening thoughts. Hope I didn't go on too long. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin, for this practical ideas and sharing the values and the practices from the Atlantis Foundation. And as you pointed out, that innovation should require cross-pollination of ideas. And the problem would require a kind of multi-layered, multi-sectoral, multi-skilled understanding in innovations to flourish. So thank you for those ideas. Let's move on to our next segment of the program, which we are calling Deep Dive Conversation. And the ideas that Ingrid and Martin have thrown, we'll take some of those. But let me remind the two questions that we are primarily going to discuss here. What are the best funding practices that foster development innovations by civil society? And the second one, what needs to change in the current funding practices of resource providers to foster such development innovations by civil society? And we have 4 discussions. Shudha Srinivasan from the Nudge Foundation, Dr. Samar Verma from the Ford Foundation, Dr. Ashok Khosla from Development Alternatives, and Dr. Barry Knights from Centuries, and he's also part of Wings. Both are based in the UK. Let me start with Sudha. And the first question is, what are the best practices? And the best practices that the Nudge Foundation is promoting, and not only Nudge Foundations, but the practices that you know of, you are aware of, and you are proud of those innovations. So what we'll do, we'll go multiple rounds, but shorter intervention from all of you. Take 3-4 minutes to make your initial remark, but then we'll continue this conversation. And in the process, Ingrid, Martin, will also invite you to be part of this conversation. Sudha, let's start with you.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring to hear both Ingrid and Martin speak, and totally resonates, right? And is actually this founding motivation for a lot of our work. So the question that begs answering is, who is most motivated to innovate to solve social problems? And it's not the markets, because there's no money to be made in solving a lot of the social markets, although markets have played a very critical role in creating innovations that eventually trickle down to the base of the pyramid. But the motivation to go and solve for the base of the pyramid is very scarce. It's not the government either, because government is not in the business of innovations. Right? So government is in the business of scaling up the right innovations after they have been proven at some meaningful scale by the private sector. The most motivated to solve for the problems of poverty, of environment, or ending world hunger is civil society. But unfortunately, its charter to innovate has also not come forth in a very compelling manner. Civil society has been chartered to deliver services and ensure that they deliver to what they signed up to do for the philanthropists or the grant makers. But it has never been called out as a challenge to go innovate on a model that will eradicate poverty or end the problem. And that kind of reflects in the paucity of innovation capital in the sector. And that's something Ingrid called out quite powerfully. There is a dearth of risk capital, of patient capital that is required to innovate and solve problems at scale. In all the examples that Ingrid shared, right, I think the one notable exception is Akshay Patra, where they indeed did get that early stage seed capital, not just to serve food to hungry children in the state government schools, but to design that optimum kitchen and ensure that every child gets a freshly cooked meal at a certain price point or less. And it didn't happen overnight. It was a journey of deep innovation and refinements, but with the backing of a donor that was patient and gave them the time and space to figure out not just the innovations of the design of the kitchen, but also the model in terms of how that plate of food would be funded, government's participation, collaboration of other private sector players and such. And what we have today is the ability to solve for that problem across the country very predictably. That's kind of what we want to bring about through our work at the Center for Social Innovation. We started off with incubator and accelerator programs. The quest is for models that will be game-changing in a diverse range of areas of the development sector, from affordable housing to education to healthcare to livelihoods. It's about bringing to existence a different breed, a breed of nonprofits that are hungry, that are impatient to achieve their goals, but will do it thoughtfully in close collaboration with the communities that they work in, and sustainably solve those problems and move the needle in a reasonable time horizon. So that in a nutshell is kind of where our mind is at in terms of innovation for the social sector.
Thank you, Sudha. Let me go to Samar, Dr. Samar Verma from the Ford Foundation. Samar, you have to unmute.
Yes, sorry. Thank you, Kostav, and my sincere apologies for being late on this.
Samar, we can't hear you properly. Is it because of the mic that you are using?
Can you hear me better now?
If you bring it closer to your mouth.
The closest. Now I'll have to chew my microphone.
Okay. Okay. Go on, please.
Well, my apologies. There are some signal issues at the place I am in at the moment. So if I'm not audible at any point, Kostav, do point out, and I'll be very happy to repeat what I said. I'll be very quick. I think a lot of what needs to be said as factors and critical issues in the context of innovation has already been very eloquently expressed by Ingrid, Martin, Sudha, and including in some of the challenges that you portrayed, Kostav. But before I say what I want to say, I just wanted to echo my panelists in congratulating Priya at completing this milestone, and also thank you for inviting me to be part of this family, which is celebrating such an important milestone, both in depth, in your impact, and the wisdom that we have benefited from as as we have walked together with Priya for at least some part of your journey. So I wanted to thank you for that. So I'll just say a couple of things. One, all of what has been said are critical factors, and there is no, I will doubt very much if anybody will disagree. The key question is, why has this not happened so far? Frankly, a lot of institution building or the kind of patient capital or the need for learning space or space for failure is something that has been in discussion, something that people like some of people on the panel itself have pointed out for a long time. While some funders have been a little bit more, you may say, progressive on this count, and I certainly take pride in saying that at Ford, we have been far more progressive than many other funders, but many others have found it difficult for a variety of reasons to tread this path. And I think it's important to understand why that has been so. Now, why there might be factors related to internal dynamics or the vision of the funders themselves, the founding funders, etc. One thing that we thought we could bring to the table is more evidence on why is it important to provide the kind of patient capital, provide the kind of multi-year, long-term support, core unrestricted support for building institutions, for building foundational core strengths of organizations. And towards that end, I'm also very proud to report that we had 4 other donor partners who joined hands on an initiative which is called as Pay What It Takes initiative. And the name itself very clearly points out that the lacuna that civil society organizations have been suffering for a long time has been reluctance of many donors to just simply pay the total indirect costs that they should honestly be paying as they fund donors, as they fund the grantee organizations. It's interesting that this, this work was actually funded by not only us, but very able partners in A.T. Chandra Foundation. We had Umidyar Network, we had others as well. Bridgespan did this work for us. And I just wanted to share a few data from that, which I think is very telling. And that's the evidence that I'm talking about when I'm saying why it is important that we bring in this kind of capital into civil society organizations. And perhaps even alarming that if on average, so when PWIT Bridgespan did this survey for 40 NGOs and did a deep dive of their finances, they discovered that in 28 of these 40 NGOs, indirect costs were not covered by the donors. Now that's the average figure. Let me disaggregate it for you. In these 28 NGOs, which found donors wanting in terms of providing the kind of indirect cost support that they actually incurred, the gap was as high as 13% of the total budget, which basically means that some donors were actually getting a cross subsidy from others who were paying those indirect costs because they were not paying as high as 13% of the indirect costs that they should have been paying by virtue of through the programming costs. Now, that was quite a telling statistic for us. We also learned that organizations which had the benefit of working with donors who were paying the indirect costs and providing for multi-year long-term support actually did better in terms of strengthening their organizational resilience, developing their organizational development, and eventually improving their effectiveness and impact in the areas of their work compared to those that unfortunately did not benefit from such unrestricted funding. So we now have clinching evidence to suggest that we need to change. Funding practices need to change across the board. That, I think, is something which is important. from our point of view, when I look at some of the factors which I think are underlying all the drivers that have been pointed out, which are required to change the mindset, to me, there are 3 or 4 key things that stand out. One is empathy. For people like us in this sector, perhaps it's a word which is very, very easily understood. It's a word that we often gloss over, and perhaps it's self-effacing. We don't talk enough, as Ingrid said. But I think it's important that there is an element of empathy which is built into transactions and engagements across stakeholders that we interact with. That's one. Second is, we need to bring in a culture where we value evidence, we value data. Now, why is it important? Because in absence of data and evidence, or in the situation where evidence and data is not valued, even if they are present, we end up making the kind of mistakes that we have been making. That's the second thing. The third thing is openness to change as a result of these findings. It's one thing to have the data and the evidence speaking to you. It's quite another to be open to change as a result of that evidence. And fourth is, as champions, we should be willing to take it forward, create collaborative networks to take these kind of newer ideas forward. So to me, these are some of the critical things that we need to do as the stakeholders in the group. And I clearly agree that donors should take the primary responsibility for doing these kind of things. So just because of the privileged position that they in. And that to me is critical when we are going to look at why, despite knowledge, we have failed to be as, let's say, progressive in our funding practices as they should be. And just one last point, Vastu, which is, I think the onus also lies on the NGOs themselves. One of the interesting findings of the survey, and this is no surprise to any of us on the panel, was also that quite often, driven again by many factors, NGOs do not have the capacity or do not display the capacity to accurately compute their indirect costs and the core costs, and they don't share it with donors enough, or certainly not as many times as they need to do. And I think that also needs to change. So these are just some of my thoughts. We can talk a little bit more about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samar, for underlining the characteristics of some of the enabling characteristics of these funding mechanisms, and the word that you have used, empathy and openness. Those are key words, and we need to expand the meaning of these words in practical terms. That what does it take to make them a practice, a regular practice? Dr. Ashok Khosla, we are extremely proud that to have you with this in this conversation. And the very creation of development alternatives was an innovation. And we are very keen to learn from you. And over the years, development alternatives have series of innovations, not only in technology, but also creating an intersection between technology and people, taking those innovations to the people. We are very keen to hear from you that not necessarily the exact innovation, but the environment in which those innovations happen. And what are you missing today? We'll be extremely thankful to listen to your perspective on that. Dr. Khosla. Dr. Khosla, you have to unmute.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, yes.
Great. I feel, very humbled to be in this company, because anything I say is going to sound extremely pedestrian after what I heard Indra, Ingrid, and Martin, and all the others, Samar and Sudha, say, because they've touched on almost every point that that I would have liked to make. I can bring us down maybe to earth a little bit by giving you stories. Maybe that's something that might be useful, that illustrate exactly what the others have said, what Ingrid has said so logically and beautifully, and Martin with extreme passion about what it takes to set up an organization and institutional framework that can truly contribute to changing the circumstances in which we find ourselves. First of all, let me congratulate Priya at 40. My own organization is 39, so we're just right behind you. We're following as fast as we can. In fact, this morning we were trying to figure out our taglines and slogans, and I haven't got very far with that. But at 20, when Priya was 20 years old, it did something quite amazing. And they may have forgotten about it, but they did a report for DFID, for the UK aid agency, in which they actually described a wonderful new approach to funding, which is let civil society design funding mechanisms and implement them. And they came up with a report that DFID bought lock, stock, and barrel, and actually provided a budget, a fund, for a new program which they called PACS, the Poorest Areas Civil Society Program. They put 25 million pounds, at that time 250 crores, quite a lot of money, into a single project and management fees on top of that. This was the money that was actually meant to be spent on the ground to work in the 100 poorest districts of India, which were defined by the Planning Commission at the time, to actually build the capacity in these 7 states of 100 districts of civil society, basically to get a civil society organization to go out there and work in 100 districts and come up in 5 years with a whole new network and ecosystem supporting major civil society action. And it was called PACS, as I say. And because Priya had actually invented the idea, they were not eligible for implementing it, which was very unfortunate for them, but very fortunate for Development Alternatives because we got the contract. So we and Priya were more or less joined at the hip at 20 years old. And although we got tremendous moral and intellectual support from Priya, we had to go out there together with in partnership with PwC, Pricewaterhouse, who were actually just the financial managers. They had to make sure that all the money was spent actually out in the field. And they deposited actually 5 of their staff members permanently in our office. And we went out and did this. Now, it was a good program. I mean, I can say truthfully, after now it was finished around 15 years ago, we made more friends, even from people whom we didn't fund, than any major network, civil society network could have done. So out there, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of organizations, from small CBOs, community-based organizations, to very large national and international organizations now, capable of doing amazing stuff because of that program. So to the credit of DFID and to the credit of Priya in having convinced them, I just want to give you an example of where the ball was picked up by civil society and run with it for civil society. And I think if you were to do an evaluation, and indeed, of course, the British government did every year an independent evaluation, and at the end of it, not only was pleased enough to give me an OBE, was pleased enough to continue the kind of work that was being done in in India and in other places. So I just give you that as an example of how it is possible to get so-called philanthropy designed to some extent by civil society. And I really want to thank Priya for the very creative approach that they put that into effect. I'm not sure it was infectious enough for having been that ball being picked up by other aid agencies. I wish they had done, But DFID certainly learned a great deal from it. And had it not been for changes in their politics and their political leadership and so on, it probably would have continued in even larger amounts. I know that we're going to be coming back in second rounds, and I don't want to monopolize this. But while I have the floor, I do want to say that this was not the only. Over those 39, 40 years, we raised more than $300 million from various donor agencies. And I have to tell you, the ones that really helped us make a difference, make a major contribution in what we would call innovation in one kind or another, whether it was technology, whether it was institutions, whether it was perceptions, whether it was the optics of how development should take place. MacArthur Foundation, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, perhaps the most important of all in our lives was the Swiss Development Cooperation Agency, but IDRC, and recently a Spanish bank called CaixaBank, it's the largest bank in Spain. Their foundation, which is actually the third largest foundation in the world, basically have provided tremendous creative innovation support by helping us build the capacity and build the people and so on. And one lesson I learned was that against each one of these, I have a name. There was a person who bought into the need to nurture creativity and innovation. There was, and not necessarily the top person. It was a program officer, somebody like Lincoln Chen in Delhi, or Dan Martin in Chicago, or David Girard in New York, or Urs Hirely again in Delhi. Now, these are people who came and saw and said, we like what you're doing. We think your knowledge of the system is better than ours. And indeed, the Swiss Development Cooperation Agency came to us and said, after 3 projects, they said, you're grown-ups, we're grown-ups. We're going to have an agreement now for HID, human and institutional development. We will provide you with X amount of money, which was significant. It was a very large amount. And only once a year, we will meet at the heads of organization level and exchange ideas. You tell us what we should be doing in development, and we will tell you what we think you ought to be doing, but you please get on with the job and do what you can creatively do. This was not just liberating, it enabled us to do amazing stuff. I don't want to, as I say, monopolize the floor, and I've got lots and lots of things I'd like to share, which I think are appropriate for this group. But let me just say that no matter how great the intention of a philanthropic agency is, it's the vision and the flexibility and ability to grab of the program officer that you deal with that can really make a big difference. And I'd like to appreciate the ones that I had to my organization had to deal with. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khoshla. Well, it was fascinating and so inspiring, to hear your testimony about Priya, but also, about the story of development alternatives. Let me invite Dr. Barry Knight. But before I invite Barry, let me also request our participants that if you want to speak or make any comment, please raise your hand. After Barry will come to you. But as you listen to all the presenters, you can also type in your question on Q&A section, and we'll try to pick up those questions as well. So you are very much part of the conversation, not only as listener, but also as a contributor to this discussion. Barry, you had the privilege of listening to 5 presentations and 5 thoughts. There are sort of overlapping similarities, but there are unique thoughts as well. What do you think that what kind of ecosystem has to evolve to support innovative work of the civil society? Barry.
Thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be here, and I'm going to say a bit about Priya in a minute. But first, I just want to say that having listened to all of the presentations, I think that a synthesis of them would actually give you the answer you've just asked me. because if you bring those principles together, I've just found myself nodding in appreciation with everything that people have said here. And, there's not much more I can add to your first question about, what are the good funding practices, except there's one campaign going on that I think may be relevant to this discussion. And it's the Shift the Power campaign, which began formally in 2016 in Johannesburg, where 400 people, mostly from the global south, gathered together in order to say enough was enough from the behavior of funders from the global north, to say that how little money was coming from the checkers of London and Washington and other northern capitals that actually reached civil society activists in the global south. Estimates vary, but it's generally between 1% and 2%, which suggests that a lot of problems were occurring in terms of the access to resources, and large numbers of staff sitting in offices in the global north administering funds to the global south seemed to be not a good idea in terms of development. And the Shift the Power campaign was to flip that, designed to flip that, to show that actually participation of people in the global south, what was needed to be supported, and that they should be in charge of the ideas that actually drove the funders, rather than the funders being in ideas that drove the civil society activists. Because relating to what Martin said is, where is the knowledge? And it's generally actually in the field, whereas people who have highly paid professional jobs, who wouldn't know poverty if it jumped up and bit them in the neck, are not necessarily the best people to actually think about poverty programs. And the Shift the Power campaign in the Johannesburg meeting, it became trending in 5 countries over the world while the meeting was going on. And there is a family of organizations, civil society organizations, community philanthropies, that are actually working together to actually build the power of civil society from the ground up. And funders are beginning to respond. There is now a Shift the Power group of funders. Organizations like Comic Relief have realized that actually they need to behave differently, because they've been behaving in a very colonial type way, administering goods to Africa rather than actually enhancing the assets of Africa. And that there's, I think, 3 key things that we can do as a result of this meeting, that, or maybe 4, but the first one is to organize. Organize is something that Priya did 40 years ago. It had this idea that participatory research was actually really important. And it taught, the stimulus for that came from the global south. Rajesh and I wrote a book together in 2002 in which we traced the history of participatory development. And it's clear that that's a southern idea which was exported to the north. And really, northern donors are typically not good at learning from stuff that's not in their immediate experience. So the Shift the Power campaign is one way of organizing and actually forcing people to do things differently, which brings me to the point of sanctions, which the Shift the Power campaign has not shied away from, actually saying, you know what, you're very white and you're very colonial. So that the emergence of the Black Lives Matter campaign is a stimulus to actually for funders doing things differently. The environmental campaign, funders are still very poor actually funding environmental issues. The violence against women, which has come really to the fore in the pandemic. Those issues really intersect into a new world and reflect the fact that funders need to think about those kinds of issues and should be judged on those kinds of questions. The third point is measuring what matters. I was very taken with what Samar said about the need for evidence, but whose evidence? One of the things that the Global Fund for Community Foundations, Candid, which used to be the Foundations Center, and PSJP did over the past 2 years was to talk to 130 civil society activists in different parts of the world, Russia, Mexico, Brazil, Serbia, other countries too, Canada, US, about what things really mattered to them. And what those things that really matter to people are things like hope, dignity, things that are really difficult to measure, and where the domination of the log frame in international development, which breeds the fantasy that somehow funders can, in a linear relationship, track their resource use through processes, through to outputs, through to outcomes, through to impact, is simply an illusion in a world where we are thinking about ecosystems, because ecosystems are the really key thing we need to think about, because the intersection between race, gender, environment, the economy is what we face. So we need that broad base of what civil society brings, that holistic picture, to actually come together in a way and a new narrative that gets governments, by and large, who are out of the picture, who are way behind the thinking, the innovative thinking that some of you and Ingrid actually described in some detail. They don't really get it. And we need different ways of actually writing about this, showing images that that people can connect to, so that people actually begin to be and think and do things differently. Because I think the funding world has had its own way, uncriticized for too long. And I think we need to actually gear up our kind of advocacy around that field. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barry. I think the example that you have used, this shift the power, I think is an important one. And many of the things that Samar, Barry, and Martin, you have talked about, the flow of money from the northern countries to the southern countries. But in Indian context, we are also, in a way, confronted with another layer of complexity, is the shifting power from the corporate donors to the civil society organizations, and how do we sort of make that shift less painful and more sort of cooperative and meaningful, and all the parameters that you have talked about, organizing or sanctioning or measuring what matters, all those conversations need to happen. So let me go to the second round of our discussion, and this time, if I start with Ingrid again, that what needs to happen? I mean, a lot of values have been spoken in this conversation, but we need practical tools and practical gears to have that meaningful conversation. So how do we do that, Ingrid?
Across a lot of food for thought across the last several speakers. I think, so this is about shifting norms. And this is about moving hearts and minds as much as making good arguments. I think there are a few examples of how this has been done in other domains. I think Shift the Power is an excellent example of this, and we really need to look at how we can emulate some of what they've achieved. I think institutions like, for example, the National Center for Responsive Philanthropy in the US, which annually holds up a mirror to US philanthropy and says, here's how abysmally badly you're doing when it comes to funding the issues that matter. So being able to produce that kind of evidence, not just evidence of what works and what doesn't, but simply, saying to philanthropy, here's what you funded, here's what you failed to fund. Getting there, of course, would need us to work to ensure that Indian philanthropy becomes more transparent. What we're dealing with there is a complete stonewall when it comes to their willingness to share data. And we need a small group of what some are referred to as perhaps progressive philanthropists, progressive Indian philanthropists, to lead by example on this, and then perhaps we can exert some peer pressure on the majority from there. The whole area of norms around governance. I mean, Indian philanthropy, I'm not going to make any friends here today, clearly. Indian philanthropy is the last sector in India that is allowed to be completely opaque and completely unaccountable. The average foundation board is family and friends, usually just family, actually, not even friends. There is zero transparency, zero accountability, zero goals even being, not even lip service being paid to diversity and equity and inclusion. And so we really need, what we think at CSIP is we need a group of a closed, safe space where funders can have conversations about these things with each other and with the people who might be interested in influencing them, or whose views they trust. These are, because we live, as you know, in perilous times in terms of simply being able to own up to having made a mistake, or owning up to not being perfect. And so funders are exceedingly nervous, and justifiably so. So to me, the one concrete thing that we can do is create that space. And this is something that CSIP is actively working on. We would love to work with anyone else who wants to be part of that initiative. The second one is what we variously refer to as infrastructure, intermediaries, ecosystem, those entities. We think that entities like Priya, like the Nudge, like CSIP, and a whole bunch of others, Dasra, Bridgespan, Sattva, AVPN, there's a whole family of these organizations, have disproportionate influence on norms. And we could double or multiply that influence if we collaborated. So the second thing that we've been working on, and something that we will be sort of restarting the conversation around, is building a loose coalition of these ecosystem organizations, so that we can all be advocating for the same norms, or for at least broadly the same norms, with all the many philanthropists that we work with. But we're not going to be able to do that if we don't practice those norms. So if our organizations are bastions of patriarchy and caste and class, then there's no possibility that we're going to have any success at convincing funders that they need to shift their norms. So I suppose the third action item, I think, would be for us to take a long, hard look at ourselves and fix our own issues before we take this argument to funders.
Sudha, what do you think?
Yeah. So just to respond to the question primarily on what needs to change, I kind of want to take this back to the part of the conversation where Ingrid shared about pilotitis, lots of pilots, not enough scale-ups, and kind of take a deep, hard look on what is funding even like today for civil society organizations. And if you were to start at the very beginning in terms of the need for angel investment, so to say, friends and family plus, for ideas that are just taking shape, and seed funding for ideas that are starting to show promise, and growth stage funding and scale-up stage funding. It requires an entire continuum of funding We all know there is enough scale-up funding for proven ideas that are already able to stand the test of a rigorous M&E exercise. Once you start doing RCTs and establishing evidence and demonstrating that impact, the opportunities do open up quite phenomenally for scale-up of good ideas. But leading up to that point, there's so many chasms through which good ideas fall today. I take the example of one of the startups we've had the good fortune to incubate, an idea that germinated at Yale, where the founder, a medical doctor himself, wanted to experiment with IoT and wearables as a means to track immunization of a child, right, and kind of drive up the percentage of immunization in tribal and nomadic communities, currently in single digits in several parts of the country, to the high 70s and 80s, which is where the goals are for most state governments. Fast forward 3 years later, they have cracked that, right? So they do now have multiple states putting in public funding from their healthcare budgets to scale up that idea. Started off in Rajasthan through the Nirogi Rajasthan scheme, and now will go to multiple states. But it's not a linear path, right? There are several times in that 3-year period where you stood the risk of such an amazing idea actually fading away because there were no takers for the intermediate stages of funding. And hence, I think what the sector needs and what the funding ecosystem needs is to take a look at whether there's a continuum of funding all the way from seed funding to scale-up funding. Deeply resonate with the shift of power conversation, and we kind of saw a role model in Mackenzie Scott when she wrote that lovely Seeding by Seeding blog and announcing her grant to several civil society organizations across the world. But somewhere in there is also the opportunity to blur the divide between the donor and the grantee. I think civil society is both sides together, right? The philanthropists are as much a part of civil society as the nonprofits doing the work. And to a great extent, these divisions are artificial, right? And it comes from the barrier of power. When the intent is strong on both sides to solve a problem, the models in which we work today can undergo a sea change. We can work very, very differently. Putting skin in the game, being far more collaborative than we are today. Sharing not just, passing not just the checks on, but actually sharing Rolodexes, sharing learnings and case studies, experiences lived in other journeys with other collaborators. The way we work is very, very artificial today. And I think if you just lowered some of these barriers and brought skin in the game together, attack the problems together, I think there's a huge opportunity in just the norms of how we function. Also a plus one to what Ingrid said earlier about intermediaries. Yes, from the standpoint of being influencers, but also from the standpoint of bringing heft to the sector overall. For the nonprofit sector to be able to attract talent, attract capital, political will, public attention, a lot of these things that are required to kind of get into the next orbit. One needs the ancillary services and the support systems. Right? So you do need basics like legal and compliance services and technology services and things like that. You also need a robust body of knowledge that is shared openly. You need research, good research, and we've kind of had that come out through all of your journeys as a powerful driver to further the narrative and to shape the narrative in the right manner. What it also serves to do is spotlight problems that in turn inspires entrepreneurs to jump in and bring in the innovation required to solve these problems at scale. So I think across all of these three, we are already witnessing a transformation, but there's just so much more to do and put us on an accelerated path to solutions that will help us see achievement of the sustainable development goals by 2030 or ending poverty in our lifetimes.
Thanks, Sudha. That the last sentence was quite inspiring. That we are already witnessing changes, and pretty much optimistic. I would say. Samar, what do you think? What can be done? What needs to change? And taking cue from Sudha's last point, that are you optimistic enough that things are changing? Are they changing rapidly? Or good enough? Robust enough?
It's just so humbling to listen to an amazing array of viewpoints and.
Samar, without chewing your mic, sort of close.
Can you hear me better? I'm so sorry about this. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. So, first of all, I think it's very humbling to listen to and a very, very wide canvas of perspectives on, just the topic that we are all discussing today. Let me just say a few things to take this discussion forward. One is that I wouldn't say I'm optimistic. What I would say is that my experience so far, especially post-pandemic, well, I shouldn't say post-pandemic, but given that now we've had a pandemic experience, my experience gives me the energy to believe that change is possible. And I say this because, in particular, the example that I was sharing with the experience of 5 very progressive funders, 4 other progressive funders with us, who joined hands to create this, to design this program called Pay What It Takes initiative. So we have the Omidyar Network, we have the SIF, the Children Investment Fund, we have the A.T. Chandra Foundation, we have the Idaljit Foundation, and of course, 4. We all came together, and coming together for a program like this was quite a smooth journey. It didn't take us a lot of rancor and bleeding to negotiate a program. I can tell you it was fairly straightforward. People had all the energy and the right willingness to do this. And that gives me not just the hope, but a belief that change is round the corner. But the second reason why I'm kind of very hopeful is based on the findings which have come out of this survey that Bitspan did. We now have robust evidence, and I'll talk about evidence in a minute, but we now have very good quality evidence based on surveys, based on what has been reported by NGOs. So it's not something which has been picked up through secondary research or through complicated analysis. It's straightforward what is reported and by the NGOs themselves, and what has been validated by secondary analysis conducted through KPMG, for instance, in the case of financial. So these, just to pick up this example and say why I am particularly very hopeful that change is now beginning to happen. They've also agreed, all of us, that we will, in our respective capacities, both as individual organizations as well as a collective, want to take this forward and build up a communication and a narrative change around this. Now, all of this is work in progress because this is only about a year-old program. So that, just to quickly respond to the question that you asked, Kostu. Having said that, I wanted to come back to 2 things. One is evidence, and I'm glad that, and thank you, Barry, for pointing this out on evidence. I've had the privilege of working with 2 of the organizations which at least Barry pointed out as, also pointed out as progressive organizations. So prior to this, I was with IDRC of Canada. And one of the things that we did in IDRC was to ask the question, 1, what constitutes evidence? And second, whose evidence matters? And as you can imagine, these are not kind of neutral, apolitical questions. They're extremely value-laden questions which are situated in a very, very power-dominating text. And I can tell you, when we were doing this, what we found out was, and this subsequently was how important it is that, and given that IDRC is into social science research, we looked at just the peer review mechanism and how, let's say, neutral or objective is peer review mechanism as a way of testing the validity of hypothesis or results and impact coming out of South. And it was seriously challenged because it was believed, based on evidence, that at the end of the day, peer review of the kind that we consider as litmus test is frankly an opinion of a group of people or an individual. And there are many things that such activities miss out, which we know from the global South are critical to trying to understand what constitutes good quality evidence. Not everything that counts, is counted, and neither is everything that is counted really counts. And I wanted to very strongly underline what Barry said as part of evidence. My last point is, I think, it goes back to what Ingrid said. And Ingrid, I want to take you on the offer of creating that safe space for funders. I'm very, very happy to collaborate with you on this. On the last point that you said, which is about creating a space or a sector-wide institution, like the one we have in the US, for instance. There are quite a few in the US actually. I think it's a critical part of the work that needs to be done. It will serve several purposes. If we have a sector-wide institution which is creating that evidence and knowledge on philanthropy, and when I say philanthropy, as Sudha very rightly said, it's not just the donors, but it's also the civil society organizations, it is the intermediaries. They all constitute what might be called as a philanthropic community. And we are, I can tell you in Ford, one of the things that we are trying to do is to actually create an institution of that kind, which is not only creating knowledge on a regular basis, but also helping to improve the credibility and increase the visibility of the sector as a whole, which is one of the things that was pointed out in the initial remarks, as we being perhaps more self-effacing than we might need to be in this age of optics matters. So I think these are some of the things that we certainly would like to do. We are committed to do. And as I said, I'm in a way, by sharing this, I'm also inviting colleagues here to join hands. Let us know what will work best. We are very open to ideas. We are very committed to making sure that we have a sector-wide knowledge platform that is created, which is not only informing and creating credibility and visibility for the sector as a whole, but also over a period of time, hopefully, with contributions from the donor community, begins to act as a mirror to what we do good and what we have not done well, and help us identify those gaps. So that would be my response, Costa.
Thank you so much, Samar. Let me go back to Dr. Khosla. Dr. Khosla, Ingrid has been talking about stitching together a loose coalition, and that coalition set the norms, both for communicating between the civil society groups and the funder groups. But Samar has also sort of illustrated that it's not only a narrow relationship of funding, but all sort of layer of intermediation between that. I'm sort of aware that we are into two layer of communications or two streams of communication. One is to deal with the current sort of government and their regulations and all other things to enable environment in which civil society can work. But another stream is to communicate to the philanthropic community, and these need to come together. At some point in time, the ecosystem covers everything. So what will be your take on these? That what can be done? What can be done?
Well, before I come to what can be done, let me share a few points that I wouldn't say are in dissent from the previous speakers, but diverge somewhat from them. I have now 39 years of experience running in a civil society organization. I don't want to call it an NGO because it's not. It's a social enterprise. In fact, it was probably the first social enterprise in the world dedicated to sustainable development. And we've had a rough time, frankly. It's been downhill. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, we were doing fantastic work because the world, the country, the policies, the philanthropic sources of funding and so on were flourishing. They were doing amazingly good, thoughtful work to fill in the sector that lies outside of government and of business. If you like, in the most simplistic terms, civil society being all that government and business is not, then, you know, the atmosphere and the environment in the year 2021 is massively deteriorated from what it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. In terms of attitudes, in terms of ownership of the problems, in terms of attitude towards solutions and so on. I'm sorry, but I look back on my 40 years and I've just seen my life slide downhill on a massive scale. What we could do in terms of innovation, in terms of radically creative thinking, in terms of putting into the minds of government, into the minds of corporates, ideas that they were receptive to, and in terms of producing results on the ground, in villages, in households, in the lives of poor women, we have not been able to do today what we used to do. The scale I'm not only talking about, but just in terms of the originality, in terms of impact. So I feel a little bit disappointed in my own inability to have been able to marshal the resources of society and the economy to be able to do better. The failure is entirely mine. I'm not suggesting that the rest of the world is bad. All I'm saying is that it hasn't been easy to retain the level of momentum, in part because what was once free air to move through then became like water, and now is like treacle. It's just impossible to move forward. The world around us has rejected the notion of inclusivity. They just go to New York and they make these promises. They make 16, 17, whatever goals, because you know, they have to have one goal for cooperation in order to achieve the other 16. The idea that you know, it's the responsibility of society as a whole, civil society in particular, to do things, I think it's been lost, frankly, and it's got to be revived. And the reason I feel hope is that the speakers in this session have been all extremely upbeat, and I think they represent, hopefully, a trend to revive things for the future. But the fact that nobody's ever recognized that civil society organizations, NGOs like PRIA, like Development Alternatives, like all, are actually subsidizing society by having low salaries, by cutting costs so meager that they can't perform. They don't. You talk about overheads not being given. You're talking about issues that an accountant can put on the books, but the accountants don't actually value the contribution of a person who should be making in industry 3 times as much money, being giving their life services at 1/3 the salary that they would be getting somewhere else. The costing is now so distorted that you cannot actually figure out what the value in monetary terms is of what civil society gives. So, you know, you may be very proud of the fact that you're covering the costs on the balance sheet, but you're not really looking at the real costs. You're not really looking at the value that the contribution is making. You're not looking at the impacts that the contribution is making. So actually, a lot of the thinking that used to be in place and was driving us along in the last few years, more or less the last decade or so, it's been overtaken. It's been overtaken by a totally different approach to what constitutes a good society, what constitutes a good economy, what constitutes a good polity. At the moment, India is going through a bad time. Indeed, a lot of countries. It's kind of infectious. The virus of authoritarianism, the virus of being totally inimical to independent voices, to independent thinking. This is not just a problem in India. It's in more than half it's in more countries that contain about 80% of the population of the world. So we're not alone, and I'm not going to suggest India is worse than anybody else, but this is where I live, this is where I care for, this is where I'm basically dedicated for the future too. And we're in pretty serious trouble. So I think we've got to wake up. I mean, civil society is the only voice at the moment that is actually questioning the way things are going. And philanthropy has to support that. It has to support it because without that, we are really going very rapidly down a dead-end path. So looking at all the issues, you know, my work, my organization's work is dedicated to what we call frugal technologies, to improving productivity, to creating new livelihoods, to improving the lives of people in whatever way we can. But we are actually now embedded in a society that doesn't want that to happen. So we've got to find ways in which we've got to open up the dialogue over there. And, you know, Priya has to carry the flag on this. There are only half a dozen institutions in the country that have the independence of thought and the voice to be able to do it. And Priya and my own organization have to carry that flag. We have a responsibility. And neither Priya nor DA is going to renege on that responsibility, but we do need help. And, you know, the philanthropic world hasn't recognized how important nurturing dissent is, nurturing independent voices is, nurturing independent thinking is, just as much as nurturing innovation. I mean, our organization has done more on low-cost housing, affordable housing, than perhaps any institution in the country, including big government ones. But, you know, that's nothing to do with what we're now talking about, which is actually for civil society to stand up and be counted and not be afraid of speaking its mind.
Thank you, Dr. Costa. Martin, you just listened to largely sort of Indian optimism, despair, hope, you know, a mixed bag. What do you think? What can be done and what we should do?
I mean, I think in listening to the whole thing, I suppose I'm always struck by the importance of us all re-examining how we think change happens and how we think change happens in the place where we're working at the time where we're working. And so I think often we are all a bit slow to do that. Because we move on very quickly to the next battle or the next issue without necessarily taking stock of the learning from what we've already been doing, but also what we see as an evolving and changing context. So I suppose one of the things which I think we all need to do is more closely examine how we think change comes about, because, you know, basically that's what this is all about, isn't it? It's about how we shift things that we think are wrong, and what are the best ways and the most effective ways to do that. You know, and that goes back to, say, some of the questions which I think Ingrid asked at the beginning about kind of, well, why aren't we doing better? And I mean, just I suppose in an example here from Northern Ireland, you know, which builds on some of the other points about evidence and all of those things. You know, sometimes we think, yeah, well, the gap was that we didn't have evidence that this was a better way of approaching things. And once we do our randomized control trials and we have all of that evidence, then change will happen. And I mean, I'm a big fan of evidence as a necessary element in all of this, but it's often not sufficient. And some of the reasons why it's not sufficient is because there isn't the political will to implement the change that we want to see made, and the evidence actually doesn't matter. Now, the evidence is often part then of making the political will, but the other interesting thing, which I think we discovered in some of our efforts in working with government, was that sometimes there was the evidence and sometimes there was the political will, but there wasn't actually the capacity, the ability, the skill set within the system to actually mainstream the change, so that the systems often lack a capacity to do transformation. And the scale of some of the problems that I think we're all dealing with is that, you know, it's not a tinkering often that's required. It's actually a transformation of the way in which mainstream public services are provided, for example. And civil servants, and I think this isn't universally true, but I'm not always sure that civil servants and government and policymakers actually have the skill sets and the capacities, and their systems aren't always designed in a way that allows and facilitates and makes change easy. And I think we often sort of think that the system itself, I mean, on the one hand, we're always all very unhappy about the system and we're always railing against the system. But on the other hand, sometimes I think we assume that it's better than it is. And so I actually are more effective or more efficient than it is. And often it's not. And one of the things which I think we could all think a little bit more is how do we help systems to do transformation better? And that may be one of the reasons why we're not doing better in our efforts. You know, we're working over with the generation of the ideas, but we're not paying enough attention to implementation of them. And so that seems to me to be how you implement change, how you change manage, what are the systems that are needed in order to do that, is, I think, sometimes a gap in our thinking. And I think, you know, if we do that analysis about how change happens in the particular issue, place, time that we're working on, that might spotlight some of these issues about where some of the barriers to change actually are.
Thank you. So, Dr. Berry, as you're saying that, you know, evidence is a necessity, but not a sufficient condition for change, changing norms, changing attitudes, changing practices. So, what do we do?
Thank you. I'm kind of going to respond to all of this, but particularly to Ashok and Martin, I think you've both kind of brought out some really important kind of practical points that we need to address. I mean, evidence is never enough on its own, and the thing that we most need, which is often lacking, is the will to do things and the ability to do things. And often, you know, I mean, having been a civil servant myself, I know civil servants are generally not bad people, but they don't feel a lot of power in the system. And they are often working in environments where politically what they want to do is not properly supported. But I think there's some practical things. Ingrid said something which I think is really critical, which is we need to join up the ecosystems, because it's very easy to fall into silos. Here is a wonderful conversation taking place largely in India. And this conversation is also happening in other places, Brazil, I know very well. In Europe, it's taking place. So that in a sense, one of the things I think we could think about is to make this a global issue rather than just a one country issue, because many places are affected by what is happening, and particularly as Ashok talked about the deterioration of the spaces that we inhabit. This is chronic and speedy. I've just done a survey for the European Foundation Centre in which the issue of closing space in many countries, many of them in former communist countries in Central and Eastern Europe and Russia, but also, so-called mature democracies, the rising level of hatred and seeing human rights and civil society activists as being part of the problem is on the rise, because as we get more and more kind of dangerous illiberal democracies or dangerous dictators taking the stand, they see us as the enemy and want to get rid of us. We're in a fight, whether we like it or not. And I think we need to recognize that right up front. This is not about us being nice people and actually, doing things that, and the politicians will leave us alone, because they won't. That's one point. I think the other point is that one of the seminal experiences in my life was spending some time in Priya's library 20 years ago, where I devoured the bookshelves, and I learned so much that it actually changed my mindset about what knowledge is, because the participatory approach to knowledge takes you in a different place from where I studied as a young scholar at Cambridge University, where as a statistician, the world only existed in 3 significant figures. And the idea of knowledge is much wider. And I think that one of the things that we could do and could be done collectively is, what is the narrative that we actually want? Because civil society is very distributed, very diverse, very disconnected from each other. So if Ingrid thinks about bringing together various ecosystems, what's the narrative that join us? What's the common principle? What's that going to add? Where are we? We don't make our case well enough. We expect to be understood, but we are not particularly good at communication. So I think organize, narrative, face the reality of the political situation which is really difficult, and actually then learn to communicate, but actually treat each other as brothers and sisters in this process, rather than people who compete over small amounts of money. The stakes are just too big now.
Thank you so much, Barry. We are sort of a few minutes over the time when we were supposed to hard stop. And I could see Ingrid and Sudha making a list of good practices. I think that's a wonderful exercise, and we need to continue that, not only making those lists, but also to see that what are the good practices within each of these examples. And can we sort of draw those norms and practices, and how do you emulate, scale up those practices? I think the research community has a responsibility to explore that. Let me invite Dr. Rajesh Tandon, we started a conversation, and now it's like we have got plenty of things. And I remember a few weeks back, our conversation started with Samar, and Samar talked about building a narrative. And Barry is talking today that what narrative we really want. Dr. Tandon, what narrative do you want?
Thank you, Kaustav, and thank you all. I mean, I've been taking notes, listening, getting provoked at times. I was hoping to speak in the middle, but then I am becoming disciplined in my. Let me tell you 2-3 stories. Many of you know that I had a reasonably decent job as a lecturer at Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. And then I left that in order to start what I thought was relevant, a sort of a movement towards giving participation and participatory research certain degree of centrality in any kind of social change process. we have heard today from Martin to everybody, put people in the center. That's what it is all about. But put people's needs, aspirations, hopes, fears, and knowledge in the center. And in order to do so, those of us who are creating that space may have to stay out of that space. So, in the third year of Priya, we didn't have money to pay salaries. And two of my young colleagues ran away. I don't blame them. Three of them stayed back. I borrowed some money from my sister quietly because my brother-in-law was a professor in IMT in Delhi, Ghaziabad. And basically, not for myself to eat, but just to have something going. And 2 years later, in 1986, without anybody's saying so, 7, 8 of us got together and we campaigned against a movement, a legislation which was going to define what is voluntary action in India through an act of parliament, a process which has gained salience once again to say what is correct civil society, what is incorrect civil society. And I traveled around the country just mobilizing people, and I took the risk. In 1991, we organized a conversation with 20, that time, international donors, including NGOs and foundations like Ford and Bilateral, with a group of civil society on mutual accountability of policies. Because many of them in those days would talk about partnership. And we said, well, we want partnership too. But partnership means recognizing the complementary expertise and resources and capacities that we bring to the partnership and becoming mutually accountable to our practices, norms, and behaviors. That was the last conversation I heard on that. And my capacity, I'm sort of triggered by what Ashok was saying. My capacity to take risk in the name of Priya has actually weakened in the last 10 years. My capacity to take risk, as Rajesh Tandon has gained, I don't give a damn. But I cannot do that at the cost of Priya. And the reason I was able to take the risk, the reason I was able to stand up, the reason I was able to partner with dissimilar others 30 years ago, 20 years ago, was because I had trust in friendships and relationships of all who were part of the ecosystem, including senior bureaucrats and politicians. The respect that I received as founder of Priya, as Rajesh Tandon, doing this kind of work, in the eyes of members of Planning Commission, Vice Chairman of Planning Commission, ministers in the cabinet of central government and in the state government, and the chief secretaries, that respect gave me courage. It gave me courage to take risk and to call spade a spade and to demand mutual accountability. I feel weakened on that account of late because I am concerned about Priya's future. And therefore, I think there are many important takeaways from this conversation. First of all, independent thinking civil society needs to take responsibility for its own agency. We are busy building people's agencies and losing our own agency. We must have the capacity to say, no, we don't want your support on these conditions. And we should be able to articulate. But that can only happen in a collective agency, cannot happen in individual actions. As several of you have said, reaching out to Sudhas and Ingrades and A.T. Chandras and Summers of this world requires shared understanding of what we are all about. And I like what Martin was saying towards the end, that we are all about making the change. And making the change, in my view, is shift the power. Without changing relations of power, no change is possible. Yes, philanthropy can be carried forward and civil society can continue, but transformative change will require coming to terms with changing relations of power, and therefore organize, mobilize, advocate, build selective strategic links inside the system while putting pressure from outside. All that needs to be done. And I hope that we can create a conversation with those of us who have lived our life in civil society, those of us who had variety of career options, and Ashok himself was he was a foreign service officer, that we made a positive choice, and we are proud of that choice, but we are feeling a little frustrated that we are not able to move forward in the same way as we had hoped. I think even though we are talking about Indian philanthropy, even though we are talking about Indian resources, which are very important, we are living in a global world. And I think the conversation about these partnerships should also be anchored in a global frame, whether it is South Africa or North America, it doesn't matter. Because many of our philanthropists, including many public sector undertakings, are making profits in a global market today, not just in domestic market. And they must be held accountable with their global peers as well. And so I think having a mechanism by which, Sudha and Samar and Ingrid and Ashok can have a conversation with 10 other people without bothering about giving money to each other, but talking together about how to take this forward. Sudha's point about stages of support. Where is the risk capital? So many times it has been said. And I think that is where we need to find a mechanism to take this forward. But I would like to suggest that that mechanism, that process must include the voices like of Barry and Martin as much as those of us from here. So thank you very much for taking this conversation forward and making some practical next steps together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tandon. It's been wonderful conversation, and thanks once again to Ingrid and Sudha to readily agree with, to partner with Priya co-hosting this discussion, and many more to come. And thank you so much, Barry. Thank you so much, Martin. Martin had to leave. He had another meeting. Samar, Dr. Khosla, and Sudha, and my colleague Yashvi. Wonderful contributions to this discussion. We'll prepare a report of this conversation, and the records are also records should also be available on Priya website when they are ready. We'll share so that you can also in turn share with your partners, your network. Thank you for joining this today's discussion.